Ah, bah, quand même. Donc, Platonism in Music, a Kind of Defense. Peter Kivy, Rutgers University. The title of my paper is meant to suggest two things, obviously. That I offer here a defense of what I shall be calling musical Platonism, and that I offer it in a far from confident tone. I have two reasons for wanting to defend it. First, because it offers a way to understand the relationship between musical works and their performances that, I believe, captures a great many of our intuitions and musical façon de parler. And second, because I think some of the objections brought against the doctrine, those in particular that claim it is musically or aesthetically counterintuitive and contrary to the way we want to speak about music, are answerable. That I am neither confident nor altogether happy in defending this Platonism is because, like any other well brought up student of philosophy, at least in the Anglo American tradition, I have a healthy skepticism with regard to Platonic metaphysics, and the multiplying of entities, particularly problematic ones, beyond need. I should also say that at the outset that I have no intention whatever of presenting any arguments in favor of Platonism in music. I shall confine myself solely to defending it against some objections, and assume that my readers know the arguments in its favor, and the details of the position in its various forms. As a result, I shall be keeping the concept of musical Platonism, for the purposes of this paper, open and distressingly ill-defined. I shall not, for instance, try to distinguish among such candidates for Platonic realism as universals, kinds, and types, assuming one wants to construe types platonistically at all. The critics that I will be considering will always make it clear which form of the doctrine they are belaboring, and I leave it to the reader to determine what other of its forms the objection in question might touch. In the first section of my paper, I will be considering what I take to be three of the most important traditional objections to musical Platonism. In the second section, two of the newer ones. None of them actually is all that old. That the traditional objections keep cropping up in the literature shows, I think, that they are far from impotent with age, and still deserve an answer. That new objections continue to arise certainly is an indication, if any were needed, of how problematical Platonism of any kind will always be. 1. Let me begin with a criticism that has been advanced by, among others, Joseph Margolis in Art and Philosophy. Margolis claims that a work of art cannot be a universal because in part it possesses physical and perceptual properties. And with regard specifically to music, and to Nicholas Wolterstorff's claim that musical works are kinds, he says later on, the essential difficulty with Wolterstorff's proposal is that we wish to say that we hear the music, that the music sounds sweet. In short, we wish to attribute certain properties to the work itself, and, on Wolterstorff's view, we literally cannot, because Margolis urges, we cannot hear a kind, nor can a kind therefore sound sweet. Toward an ontology of art works. New and his more recent works and worlds of art, Oxford, the Clarendon Press, of which more presently. Margolis is criticizing the earlier view, but the criticism can be directed with equal force at the later version. The obvious response to this is that to say I hear the music may be taken as short for I hear a performance of the music, that, in other words, the performance might be bearer of the properties that, Margolis insists, a universal or kind cannot be the bearer of. I mean here, of course, the performance taken to be the sound occurrence, not the act of producing it, both of which can correctly be referred to in ordinary usage as the performance. The initial difficulty with this response is that there do seem to be properties of works that are heard properties of them, and cannot just be fobbed off on their performances. The unity of the Goldberg variations, or the Passion of Haydn's Sturm and Drang symphonies, are surely properties of those works themselves. whether or not they are properties of all or any of their performances, and presumably, being musical unity and passion, they are audible properties. The difficulty, however, may not be quite as heavy as it at first seems, if one does not forget what a Platonic construal of works and performances commits one to. It is said that there are statements one wants to make about works of music, as opposed to performances of those works, in which some heard property is predicated of the work. And since a universal or kind cannot possess heard properties, a universal or kind cannot be what we are referring to. But it should be noticed, in this regard, that when we say something like the male lion has a name, not in reference to a particular lion, we use the same locution, and we do feel we are making some sort of characterization of the lion as well as of individual instances of it, without thinking that a logical entity can have a name. When we say the 49th Symphony of Haydn is passionate, we are, of course, saying that every properly formed instance, that is, performance of it, is passionate. But more, we are saying the work, kind or universal, is of such a nature as to be truly instantiated only by passionate performances. We are, then, saying something about the work, construed as universal or kind. We are predicating passion of it as of universal or kind, even though we are not saying that it has the heard property of passion. This may be enough, it appears to me, to accommodate our intuition that when we say the 49th Symphony of Haydn is passionate, we are not only saying something about correct performances of the work, but something about the work itself. Even though passion is, in this instance, a heard property, and universals are kinds not heard, or rather are heard through their instances, that is to say, performances, it would be odd, would it not, to be charged with the logical howler for saying the male lion has a name, on the ground that species or natural kinds cannot grow hair. To talk about a performance of a work sounds very much as if one were talking about two things, the performance and the work, one of which is standing in for the other, as in a copy of the original. But a lion is not a stand in for the kind, he is an instance of it. Similarly, to hear a performance of a symphony is to hear the symphony, is to hear the work, not a stand in for it. The performance is an instance of the work, not a substitute for it. And to make a statement about the work is to make a statement about its instances. It seems to me that once one lets musical Platonism really sink in, psychologically, the gap between theory and intuition in this regard closes considerably. Not perhaps completely, but no matter what the theory, there will be a gap somewhere. So the question inevitably comes down to how wide a gap one will tolerate and where. This is as good a place as any, and a more narrow gap than some. 2. A second objection to musical Platonism, of more elaborate and searching nature, can again be taken initially from Margolis, although I will go on from there to consider a more recent variation on the same theme. Margolis says that a work of art cannot be a universal because in part it is created. Later on, with specific reference to music, and again to Volstov's views regarding it, he intimates that music cannot be a kind because it is clear that music is actually invented, and clearly one cannot invent or create a kind. I now want to spend a few minutes at the seemingly impossible task of convincing you that it would not be widely counterintuitive to construe musical composition as a kind of discovery, rather than as a kind of creating or inventing. Page 4. Let me talk just a bit about invention. The Wright brothers invented the airplane. I suppose that is a paradigm of invention, if anything is. But in order to do that, they had, as we now know, to discover certain aerodynamic principles first. They were not, it turns out, merely a couple of lucky tinkerers. Every invention is part discovery. Edison had to discover the right material for a filament, and that it burned more properly in a vacuum, in the process of inventing the thing we turn on and off at night. The reason we call the end product of the Wright brothers and Edison's activities inventions, and the activities inventing, is that the thing they are remembered for is something we think of as not having existed before they started work, and existing after. But just as invention is part discovery, discovery is part invention. Michelson discovered the speed of light, if you will permit me to use the word discovery in this regard. To do this, however, he had to invent what is now called the Michelson interferometer, no small scientific accomplishment, as Einstein noted in recognition of Michelson's genius. Gödel discovered the theorem which bears his name, but he had to invent Gödel numbering to do it. Of course, in mathematics, our strong inclination to Platonize makes it unclear whether we don't want to say instead that he discovered Gödel numbering rather than invented it. In any case, we think of the speed of light, or Gödel's theorem, or permutation groups, or what have you, as discovered rather than invented because, of course, although inventions may have made their discovery possible, they were there all along and were not brought into being. I mention this to make it clear, first, that if Mozart discovered his music rather than invented it, there was just as much complexity to his discovery, just as much give and take between discovery and invention, as there was to the discovery of the speed of light by Michelson, of the incompleteness theorem by Gödel, or permutation groups by Galois and Abel. So I am not necessarily suggesting that Mozart was not, in part, an inventor or creator as well as a discoverer. What I am suggesting is that it may be more plausible to think of his works as Platonic objects of some sort, and, therefore, things that could not have been brought into being. But just as inventing is not all making, so discovery is not all finding. A discovery of any great complexity and significance is invention or creation as well. But surely, you will insist, this is not enough. For wasn't Mozart a creator in the paradigmatic sense of that word? Wasn't he a creative artist? Isn't music one of the creative arts? In calling Mozart a discoverer, am I not taking more away from him than intuition will allow? Well, in one sense of creator, then there never has been one at all except the Lord God Jehovah himself. For even Plato's Demiurge, a very creative fellow, from all accounts, didn't create ex nihilo. So if Mozart must have been a creator, he was a demiurge and not the deity. But what distinguishes him from any other sort of ordinary maker? Well, he was original. Or he made things that nobody else could make, if that doesn't come to the same thing. Or he made things of a certain kind better than almost anyone else has ever been able to do. Which we can pack all of that just as well into Mozart the discoverer as Mozart the creator. The operative word here is not creator but creative. Surely Mozart was creative if anyone was. He was a creative as, well, Galois or Abel or Michelson or Gödel. Would you deny that they were creative? They are, after all, humdrum discoveries as well as creative ones. When Archimedes jumped out of the tub, he had done more than just take a bath. It takes nothing away from Mozart's creativity, in the important sense or senses of the word, to think of Mozart as a discoverer rather than as an inventor or creator. His lustre remains untarnished. In the company of Newton, after all, one is hardly slumming. But perhaps we have moved too quickly. There may be more to the question that has yet been uncovered. In particular, we are perhaps giving up more, it may be felt, in construing the composer as discoverer rather than creator, than intuition will allow. Recently, in defending the view that a piece of music in some sort of structural type, Gerald Levinson has, nevertheless, made just this point, and insisted on what he calls the requirement of creatability, to wit, musical works must be such that they do not exist prior to the composer's compositional activity, but are brought into existence by that activity. His reason for insisting on this is worth going into. It is twofold. It is in What Musical Work Is, the Journal of Philosophy. The main reason for holding to it is that it is one of the most firmly entrenched of our beliefs concerning art. The whole tradition of art assumes art is creative in the strict sense, that it is a godlike activity in which the artist brings into being what did not exist beforehand, much as a demiurge forms a world out of inchoate matter. A second closely related reason to preserve true creation vis-à-vis musical works is that some of the status, significance, and value we attach to musical composition derives from our belief in this. There is a special glow that envelops composers, as well as other artists, because we think of them as true creators. Levinson's first claim that the artist as godlike creator is a firmly entrenched belief is, to begin with, if not false, at least greatly exaggerated. What does entrenched mean? Hmm. Okay. In addition, even if it were true, without exaggeration, it would not be above being given up, for it is what it is supposed to explain, in my opinion, not its inherent plausibility of itself, that gives it what appeal it has, and what it is supposed to explain is in no need of that hypothesis at all. First, as to its truth. As a matter of fact, the notion of the artist as godlike creator has a history, and not such a long one at that. Although suggested by Sir Philip Sidney in the Apology for Poetry 1595, it does not really come into its own until the end of the 18th century, partly through the influence on the Romantic movement, I imagine, of Kant's third critic. It is, then, a gross exaggeration to suggest, as Livingstone does, that it is one of the most firmly entrenched of our beliefs concerning art. And it is just plain false that the whole tradition of art assumes art is creative in the strict sense, that it is a godlike activity in which the artist brings into being what did not exist before. The tradition of art did without this assumption until barely 200 years ago, and managed to produce without it the Iliad, Odyssey, the Greek plays, Gothic cathedrals, Shakespeare, the Italian Renaissance, Bach, Handel, Haydn, Mozart, and a good deal more. Bach did not think he was God. Wagner did, with dire results. But more, it is at least in part to explain another common belief that the Romantic movement gave birth to, or at least nurtured to maturation, the concept of the artist as godlike creator. That is the belief in the originality of the great artist, another belief, it must be remembered, that has not always been with us, and has itself a distinctly romantic aroma. But that as it may, it is, in part, to explain what makes a work of art original, that the notion of the artist as godlike creator is invoked. For what is the original but that which has never before existed, and is therefore unique? Then what but a creation, and who but a creator, can burgeon forth that which has never been before? The playing off of these concepts against one another produced a hideous caricature of scientific discovery, already apparent in Kant's Critique of Judgment, and even more pronounced in Schopenhauer. For since, on the romantic view, originality can only result from creation, and the scientist is a mere discoverer, the scientist, even of the stature of Newton, can never deserve the epithet creative, nor therefore genius, the etymological connection between genius and genesis being too obvious to belabor here. But once the romantic circle connecting creation, genius, and originality exclusively together is broken, we can see that originality no more requires a godlike creator than does creativity itself, when understood in its full honorific sense. As Jack Lichtman points out, we can say an activity such as painting, writing, or composing is creating if it achieves new and valuable results. In creativity in the arts, culture, and art. And to that list, we can add scientific and mathematical discovery as well, thus giving them their rightful place as creative enterprises. It is the achieving of new and valuable results that warrants the epithet creative, and it makes no matter whether that achieving is inventing, discovering, or creating in the godlike way. An original, creative discovery is not, in the literal sense, the bringing into being of what has never before existed, for then, of course, it would not be a discovery in the literal sense. It is the revealing, needless to say, of what has always been there, but which no one has yet had the genius and creative imagination to see, and it is all one whether the discovery is a scientific or a musical one. One further word about Livingston's first argument for the uh, creatability requirement. I venture to assert, without documentation, for the documentation would require a book, that the language of discovery throughout history is as pervasive throughout history in discussions of what artists do as is the language of godlike creativity. That in itself, if it is true, should later rest the claim that the concept of the artist as godlike creator is either essential to the Western tradition in art, I will say nothing of the non-Western, non-original traditions, or that it is one of our most firmly entrenched intuitions about the enterprise. Moving on to Livingstone's second argument, we see that it too, like the first, makes a factual claim from which the creatability requirement is supposed to follow, or which at least is supposed to strongly suggest its acceptance. The factual claim is simply that we would value the composer and the composition less if the composer were merely a discoverer, not a creator, and the composition a pre existent entity to be found out, rather than a creation that never before existed. This multiple fact urges upon us, on Livingstone's view, that we preserve the creatability requirement. Assume for the nonce that the actual factual claim is true. Is this a very strong reason for maintaining the creatability requirement? I hardly think so. It may be the case, for example, that an instrumental interpretation of scientific theories results in a lower estimate of scientists and their creations than a realistic interpretation would do. For, after all, on an instrumental account, scientists cease to be sages, and their theories cease to be revelatory of the nature of things. Rather, the former are now merely contrivers of artifacts for the use of man, the latter those artifacts. Indeed, it is sometimes suggested that the transition from the medieval view of astronomy as merely the saving of the appearances to a more realistic interpretation of the enterprise helped spur the astronomers on to the great accomplishments of the scientific revolution, just because it made their work seem more significant in their eyes. But it is difficult to imagine anyone arguing for the realistic interpretation on the grounds that, if it is accepted, science and scientists would get higher marks. In any case, however, the factual assumption, and that I think is all it is, an unsubstantiated assumption, does not seem to me to be true, or at least the waters are far more muddy than Levinson's rather artless claim makes them out to be. Composers, as a matter of historical fact, have tended to balk at the idea that they are mere makers or creators of artifacts, no matter how original those artifacts might be. If music were a mere created artifact, a kaleidoscope or arabesque in sound, to appropriate Edward Hanslick's description, it would become, perhaps unjustly, lower in the estimation of most of its practitioners, as well as its audiences. Page 9. The composer wishes to be known for just what Levinson seems to suggest would tarnish his reputation. He wishes to be known as a discoverer and purveyor of truths about the world, like almost everyone else in the Western tradition, obsessed as it is with knowledge and the acquisition thereof. Now, of course, the composer generally wishes to be known not merely for discovering sound structures, but sound structures that are somehow revelatory of something beyond themselves, the metaphysical will, the emotive life, the harmony of the spheres, or what have you. But discovery, as opposed to godlike creation, is not what is at stake here. There is no advantage in being a godlike creator rather than a mere discoverer, if what one creates are mere structures in sound, although I suspect that discovery may, even here, have the edge over creation, since, in a funny Platonic way, one is at least finding something out about what there is, rather than merely actualizing the trivial. Where there is an unqualified advantage, as most musical thinkers in the past have seen it, is in being a discoverer through music of something beyond mere musical structure, something out there in the real world. It is this wish to puff up the composer and his works that has led to most of the extravagant theories of music in the past, and in the present as well. And it hardly bears out the claim that to call the composer a discoverer is to rebuke him either in his eyes or in the eyes of his public. It is only a rebuke if what he is alleged to discover is mean in his eyes. But in that case it hardly is less a rebuke to say that what is mean in his eyes he has created rather than discovered. For I take it that to discover trash is not more ignoble a thing than to bring it into being where it was not. Surely, though, it will be objected, our whole picture of how composition goes on is completely out of phase with the notion of composition as discovery. And anyway, it is really plausible to think of an object as complex and metaphysically unwieldy as a Mozart opera or Mahler symphony pre-existing its composition. In an incredibly short space of time, let me address these two objections at once. You will all no doubt recall that dreadful relic of Victorianism, the Lost Court, poem by Adelaide Ann Proctor, music by Sir Arthur Sullivan. Seated one day at the organ, I was weary and ill at ease, and my fingers wandered idly over the noisy keys. I do not know what I was playing, or what I was dreaming then, but I struck one chord of music like the sound of a great Amen. Now surely this accidental discovery of the chord, in a fit of idle reverie, hardly jibes with the realities of musical composition. Even a musician with the awesome mental equipment of a Mozart has to work at composing. It does not just fall into his discoveries. Discoveries in music, as elsewhere, are prepared for, even though there is an element of luck too. But what may not be so implausible in the lost chord is the notion that the chord was found, discovered, rather than invented or created. That particular vertical arrangement of notes existed, awaiting discovery, as did Kepler's laws or permutation groups. Think of the Tristan chord. It seems to me quite plausible to regard it as a discovery of Wagner's rather than his invention, although, of course, the discovery of that chord required the labor of more than one lifetime. Nor does it stagger the metaphysical imagination to picture the Tristan chord, that particular relationship of four pitches, as pre-existing its discovery in the manner of a Platonic object. But after all, the Tristan chord is part of a larger relationship of pitches called Tristan and Isolde. And if you grant that small but vital part pre-existed its composition, it seems to me you are on the slippery slope that must propel you into granting that the large composition of which it is a part also pre-existed its compositional discovery by Wagner. I am told in a recent issue of Science News that the existence of the sporadic group F1 requires a proof exceeding 5,000 pages in length. If logical space or Platonic heaven has room for that, surely it can find a niche for Beethoven's Ninth or an itty bitty Wagner opera. 3. Closely related to the uncreatability of universals or kinds is, of course, their obvious indestructibility. I will close this section with a necessarily brief discussion of that, and again take my departure from Margolis. He says that a work of art cannot be universal because in part it can be destroyed. But when it comes to the particular case of music, he seems to waffle. He writes, clearly sculpture, architecture, painting, and etching can be destroyed, hence they cannot be kinds. Music and literature cannot in this sense be destroyed, simply because their properly formed examples can be generated by reference to a notation, and a notation is not a work of art. All the tokens of a notation may be destroyed, however, and the notation may cease to be remembered. Oh. In that sense, music and literature can be destroyed. It is not clear to me in what sense Margulis thinks music cannot be destroyed. Ah non, il dit que ça peut. Mm. Whether, in fact, it might not be the sense in which I think it cannot. Mm. Clearly, I am committed to the view that the sense in which the art of the fugue or the Tristan chord cannot be destroyed is the sense in which permutation groups of that 5,000-page mathematical proof cannot be destroyed. Nor does it seem at all counterintuitive to me that that should indeed be the case. If you have already accepted the plausibility of the Tristan chord as a discovery rather than an invention, and hence as pre-existing its composition, you will already have prepared yourselves for the conclusion that it cannot be destroyed, although, as we know from the Phaedo, the pre-existence of souls does not of itself imply their immortality. But if the Tristan chord existed before it was thought of or notated, why should it cease to be when all notations why should it cease to be when all notations, performances, and memories of it pass away? Mm. If it existed before anyone ever was aware of it, why should its existence be influenced by our ceasing to be aware of it? Once, I think, one is convinced that the pre-existence of a musical work holds no terrors, its immortality will seem equally if not more benign. So I will tarry no longer over the question, but go on, as I said I would at the outset, to discuss some more current objections to the Platonistic move in music. 2. 1. A recent criticism of the word-performance relation as the relation between type and token, advanced by R. A. Sharp, is not without interest. Type, token, interpretation, and performance. A criticism of Sharp along different lines can be found in R. A. Dipert, Types and Tokens, a reply to Sharp, and Sharp's reply in Performing an Interpretation, a reply. Sharp points out, quite rightly, that I can remove part of a token and replace it with part of another token and it remains a token of that type. For example, I could cut off part of a line on red flag and replace the missing part with the corresponding part of a plastic red flag of the same size. It is still a red flag, a token of that type. Suppose now that I try the same thing with two performances of the same musical work. The case, Sharp argues, is not the same, for if I remove the last movement of Waters' Das Lied von der Erde and replace it with the last movement of Bernstein's, my action does have aesthetic repercussions. For one thing, we expect a conductor to present in performance a unified view of the work. If Sharp's intention has been to establish by such examples that there is logical disanalogy between the flag and the musical work, he has not, so far at least, accomplished that intention. Patching together a flag token from two separate flags tokens of the same type produces a flag token of the same type. But it needs pointing out a flag token of rather poor quality, half line and half plastic, with an unsightly seam. Likewise, a performance with which two conductors share is going to be, in all likelihood, a poor performance, with its own musical seams. But it does not, on that account, fail to be your genuine, recognizable token performance of the type work. For certain purposes, of course, we don't much care if a token is well or ill-formed. We can rally round a tattered flag as well as a spanking new one, whereas it will seldom be a matter of indifference to us that a performance token of Das Lied von der Erde is poor. But so far as I can see, as long as we recognize that tokens can be well or ill-formed, good or bad products, symphonies and flags are logically on all fours. But there is more to Sharp's argument than this, and it emerges in his summation of his position. The general principle is, then, that a token remains a token of a type when one part is replaced by the corresponding part of another token. Whereas a copy of a poem survives this transplantation, two performances of a single piece of music may not necessarily survive the exchange of their parts. Substitution is only possible when the two performances are performances of the same interpretation. Otherwise it will leave us with merely two parts of two different performances juxtaposed rather than a single performance. The argument here seems to be this: if all performances were tokens, and all musical works types, then since I can always get a token of any given type By piecing together two or more parts of other tokens of the same type, I should always be able to get a performance of any given work by piecing together two or more parts of other performances of the same work. But the latter, on Sharp's view, is not the case. For if the performance parts that are pieced together are two disparate, not performances of the same interpretation, then Sharp claims the result of the patchwork is not a performance of the work, but rather two performance parts. This presumably is the aesthetic repercussion spoken of earlier that prevents performances being well-behaved tokens of types. But this claim seems completely unfounded. Consider an occurrence, I will not beg the question from the start by calling it a performance, of Tristan and Isolde, the first act conducted by Leinsdorf, the second by Bernstein, and the third by Solti, each, we will assume, based on an entirely different reading of the score. What grounds are there for believing that this occurrence is not a performance of the work, but three different performance parts? No grounds at all, so far as I can see, just so long as one avoids slipping into an evaluative views of performance, such that performance becomes good performance, and being based on a single interpretation becomes the necessary condition of a good performance. I will assume that it is. As a matter of fact, I attended, some years ago, an occurrence of Tristan und Isolde at the Metropolitan Opera, which turned out to be very unusual indeed. As it happened, all three of the company's Tristans were sick. Each one, however, had enough to get through the one act. And that was the expedient fixed upon. The sopranos sang three Tristans under the table, the death of number three being particularly convincing. Now the point is that no one, after the occurrence, was ever tempted to call it anything but that extraordinary performance of Tristan und Isolde. No one referred to it as performance parts, or anything of that kind, nor, I think, would anyone have been tempted to do so if, because of the illness of the Met conductors, a different one were to have undertaken each act. Neither intuition nor linguistic usage seems to support Sharp's contention that in such cases we would not have a performance but many performance parts. That being the case, why should we accept it? Merely to support Sharp's theory? Not clearly if we have a prior commitment to the work-performance distinction as an instance of the type token one. Surely neither Sharp nor anyone else would want to argue that it is analytic to the notion of a performance, as used in musical contexts, that a performance must be the act of one person. Were that to be claimed, we could not, of course, have a performance of a symphony, an opera, or even a string quartet, except in a keyboard arrangement, since they are all cooperative adventures. Even less does it seem analytic to the notion of a performance that it be based on one or one person's interpretation. The NBC Symphony Orchestra, after the death of Toscanini, played for a number of years without a conductor at all, and although its performances might well have been criticized for lacking the unity or singleness of purpose that a conductor would have given them, there is surely nothing odd, logically or linguistically, in calling them performances. No music critic, to my knowledge, ever called them anything else. Performances that produce an adequate number of the right notes, and fulfill an adequate number of the other requirements of a correct performance, may range in quality from great to terrible, unified to eclectic, but not from performance to non-performance or performance parts. The conclusion, I think, must be that Sharp has not succeeded in showing any logical disanalogy between the type-token distinction and the work-performance one. Just so long as one bears it in mind that at least some types can have both well-formed and badly formed tokens, it will cause no problem to discover that performance parts can seldom be joined together without deleterious aesthetic repercussions. For there is a world of difference between an ill-formed token and no token at all. What Sharp was obliged to show to prove logical disanalogy is that performance parts, when not of the same interpretation, cannot yield tokens, that is to say, correct performances, at all. But all he has shown, I think, is that they cannot yield good performances, and from that only those with ass's ears would dissent. 2. By far the most logically rigorous and thoroughgoing musical Platonism to be found is in Part II of Nicholas Wolterstorff's Works and Words of Art. But ironically, Wolterstorff is willing to accept as a consequence of his Platonism a conclusion about music that, I think, any musician or musical scholar must count as a serious objection, perhaps even a decisive one, to the whole doctrine. It is this consequence that I want to examine here with some care. I think it must be answered if musical Platonism is to stand. The process of composition, on Wolsterstorff's view, can be described as a process of selection. The composer selects properties of sounds for the purpose of their serving as a criteria for judging correctness of occurrence. The end result of this selection process is, of course, works of music, which Wolterstorff construes as norm kinds, being, that is, kinds such that it is possible for them to have improperly formed examples. The lion is obviously a norm kind. The kind red thing, however, seems not to be, for there can be no such entity as an improperly red thing, a malformedly red thing. That works of music must be norm kinds is required, of course, by the fact that they can have improperly as well as properly formed examples. That is to say, a symphony can have incorrect as well as correct performances. Mhm. So far, nothing that Wolterstorff has said about the musical work or its creation is inconsistent with the views I have been expressing here. Composition as selection does not seem to me to be incompatible with composition as discovery, as selection would turn out to be, on my view, a matter of choosing what discovery to record in score and thus make public. But there follows from Wolterstorff's position, so he supposes, what he refers to as a corollary concerning the art of improvisation, which, although it conflicts with nothing said so far in this paper, is profoundly contradictory of deeply entrenched musical intuitions that I share with many others. It is this supposed corollary that I want to examine and dispatch, for I believe that it is neither true nor a genuine consequence of Ostertoff's Platonism, and would, indeed, if true, constitute a serious objection to it. The corollary is that to improvise is not to compose. Ostertoff goes on, that corollary is clearly correct. Suppose that someone has improvised on the organ, and suppose that he then goes home and scores a work of such a sort that his improvisation, judged by the requirements for correctness specified in the score, is at all points correct. In spite of that, the composer did not compose his work in performing his improvisation. In all likelihood he did not, during his improvisation, finish selecting that particular set of requirements for correctness to be found in his score. Suppose, for example, that at a certain point in his improvisation he introduced a bit of rubato with full consciousness of doing so. In so doing, he has not yet decided whether to select rubato at that point as required for correctness of occurrence. One cannot uniquely extract a work from a performance. Let us look at a familiar historical case of improvisation. I think a bit of reflection on it will reveal how odd it would be to construe it as anything but composition. During his famous visit to Frederick the Great in Potsdam, which ultimately led to the composition of the musical offering, Johann Sebastian Bach was asked by the king to improvise a six-voiced Ricercar, a kind of fugue, on a theme supplied by Frederick himself, the royal theme. Finding Frederick's chromatic subject unsuited to the improvisation of so complex a composition, Bach improvised a three-voiced Ricercar instead. Tradition has it that when he got back home to Leipzig he wrote down, from memory, the improvised Ricercar which we now know as part of the musical offering. When did the composition of this Ricercar take place? The obvious answer is, during Bach's visit to Potsdam, more exactly, as he was playing it for the king. Surely no musician would be tempted to say that he was composing it as he was writing it down. Ah bon, that is it. The composing was already done. Bach was merely being his own copyist, recording in notation from his memory of what he had played, a prodigious feat, needless to say. That this is the only intelligible way to look at Bach's improvisation, without ending up in absurdity, can be seen by altering the historical facts just a bit. Imagine, then, that Bach's great son, Carl Philipp Emanuel, who was undoubtedly present at his father's performance, was so taken by the piece that he wrote it down from memory and that Bach's senior never did. Who, then, was the composer of the Ricocher? Mm. Clearly not Carl Philipp Emanuel, and were he to claim he was, we would accuse him, quite rightly, of plagiarism. But if improvisation is not composition, then Johann Sebastian was not the composer either. There is no candidate, then, for composer of the Ricocher, and we must conclude that it came into being without being composed at all. Now there is nothing absurd about claiming that some music comes into being without being composed. Falstaff correctly observes that there are works of indigenous folk music such that probably no one ever singled out the requisite properties in the requisite way for composing the work. The work just emerged from performances. But what is absurd, I think, is to claim that Johann Sebastian's Ricocher is such a composer-less work. Surely three-voiced fugues are not the sorts of things that grow like green leaves. And the one in question, improvised by Johann Sebastian, copied down by Carl Philipp Emanuel, owes its existence to the genius, originality, learning, and compositional choices of the former as much as do his other works. That its composition and first performance were the same act is something for us all to wonder at, but not an occasion for metaphysical conclusions even worse than musical Platonism requires. What exactly has driven Wolfstoff to insist that improvisation is not composition? It is that one cannot, on Wolfstoff's view, uniquely extract a work from a performance, and that because we cannot distinguish, merely in the performance of improvisation, without the authority of the score, apparently, what properties are requisite for a correct performance, and what merely requisite for a good one. For if, for example, the performer introduces a bit of rubato into his improvisation, we have no way of knowing, prior to his preparation of an autograph, whether the rubato is required for correctness of occurrence, is merely a performance choice of the moment, or perhaps a recommendation to be written into the score for what the composer takes to be an optimal performance. That seems to be the substance of the argument. The mistake, I think, lies in Wolfstoff's construal of musical scores as recipes for the realization of musical performances. It is not that this is wrong. Scores can be usefully seen as recipes for performances, and Wolfstoff is not the first to describe them as such. But if one just sees scores as recipes, one then comes to the conclusion, I think, as Wolfstoff has, that the conventions surrounding them only prescribe movement in one direction, from score to performance, cookbook to cookie. Such, however, is not the case, as a look at how students are taught to use scores, in what is called ear training and dictation, reveals. Every well-trained musician has learned to write down in score what he or she hears, to, in other words, take down musical dictation, just as a shorthand secretary learns to take a letter. And were there not conventions for doing this, for that is, going from sound to score, the task would not be possible. Now, the major goals of such exercises in dictation are, of course, to enable the musician to read scores and to hear music in the head, and to enable him or her to realize in notation what is heard in the head or worked out at the keyboard. The skill of taking dictation, having served its educational purpose, tends to fall into disuse. But the fact is that one can do it, at least within certain practical limits, and when scores were rare and difficult to obtain, it might well have been a useful skill as well as a musical parlor trick. A famous eight-voiced Miserere by Allegri was revered as a sacred object in the Sistine Chapel. Parts and scores were not permitted to be made or circulated on pain of excommunication. The 14-year-old Mozart, however, acquired a score for himself by listening to the work once, committing it to memory on the spot, and writing it down afterwards. With this in mind, let us return to Bach's Ricocher, the one that is improvised by Johann Sebastian and written down by his son. Suppose that there is in Sebastian's performance a slackening of the tempo, a slight holding back, just before the entrance of the new triplet figure. Should Ca' Philippe Emmanuel write Pocoritardendo at this place, thus enshrining the return in his score, or should he not? The question is not, after all, an unanswerable one. As a matter of fact, such things were far more often than no left to the performer in those days, and was seldom indicated by composers in scores. Musical convention, then, would have dictated that retard was an artifact of performance and not a property of the work. And had Johann Sebastian, in fact, also made a score of the improvisation, and written Pockerit at the appropriate place, he would thereby have produced a different version of the work, since he was under the implicit discipline of the convention during the improvisation, which made the retard simply a performer's choice. The same would apply to trills and other ornaments. In other words, the improvisation was a version of the work in which the retard was not a requirement of correct performance. And musical convention gives us reasonable assurance of that Philipp Emanuel's autograph scores that version of the work on the authority of the reigning musical conventions. Sebastian's autograph, with Pockerit in the appropriate place, becomes a different and more definitive version of the same work. It is true that Carl Philipp Emanuel cannot be absolutely certain, when he hears the improvisation, that the retard is an artifact of performance, and not a property of the work. But no more can we be absolutely certain about a great many things in Scotch musical works. There are conventions for interpreting them, without which they would be useless, and we helpless. But the conventions are no more ironclad and beyond question than the one telling Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach that the retard is not a part of the work. What I think we can conclude from this is that, in the loose sense of uniquely, a score uniquely determines a correct performance under a given set of implicit conventions for interpreting the score, conventions which may be quite different in different historical contexts, and a performance uniquely determines a score under a similar set of historically bound conventions for taking musical dictation. In a logically strict sense of uniquely, however, I doubt that a score uniquely determines a correct performance, or that a performance uniquely determines a score. The loose interpretation has this very important point in its favor: it can accommodate the way musicians, musicologists, and, I think, the rest of us do in fact think about and talk about such things as composing, improvisation, scores, performances, and the rest. It seems to me this point is decisive. 3. I have tried to defend a Platonic interpretation of the musical work against some new and some familiar objections. But it might well be asked, why bother? Why Platonize music? I cannot answer this question here and now, and quite frankly, I do not know if I could ever answer it any better than it has already been by such elegant practitioners as Volheim and Wolsesov. But this much I can say: when I think of the mode of existence of Bach's Ricoeur before he had time to write it down, and after he had composed it, I tremble as Darwin did at the thought of the human eye. Where did that Ricoeur exist? In Bach's head. But what is the cash value of that? What mode of existence in Bach's head did that Ricoeur have? One suggestion that seems to be implied by something Margolis says bothers me. In a passage previously quoted, he remarks, you remember, all the tokens of a notation may be destroyed, however, and the notation may cease to be remembered. In that sense, music may be destroyed. Does Margolis mean to suggest that when a piece of music is remembered or thought about, it is the notation that is remembered or thought about? Did the notation of Bach's Ricoeur exist in his head? That seems wrong to me, although I do not wish to deny that a composer can visualize notation in his head. Notation or writing, kind of writing. To remember the Ricoeur that way is to remember it the way the memorists might do in the 39 steps. A person with what used to be called a photographic memory, or absolute recall, might indeed commit the score of musical composition to memory, being all the while tone deaf and completely ignorant of music, just as I could memorize a paragraph of Serbo-Croatian, a language I neither speak, read, nor understand. I do not think that is the way Bach remembered or thought about the Ricoeur. Rather, it ran through his head, when he wanted to think about or remember it, much in the way a melody runs through the heads of lesser mortals like me. Might we then think of Bach's Ricoeur running through his head as a mental performance of the work? Perhaps that is the right way to think about it. We should not be misled here by a widely circulated, but undoubtedly spurious letter in which Mozart is made out to say that he imagines music atemporally, the whole before him in one instantaneous synoptic view. The feat is impossible, perhaps even logically, as some have claimed of God's supposed temporal perception of temporal events. Misled here. One is reminded in this regard of the statement attributed to Brahms on his being invited out to attend a performance of Don Giovanni, I think it was. "Why should I bother," he is supposed to have said, pointing to his score of the work. "I can have a better performance at home." Meaning, of course, that all he needed to do to hear the music of Don Giovanni was to read his score. But if, at least when Bach was conscious of his ricocher, a performance of it was running through his head, it makes perfect sense to ask, a performance instance of what? The work kind of or universal, of course. And before there was any notation of it. And here is where I feel impelled, wrongly perhaps, to take the Platonic plunge. Margulies believes it no small advantage of his own way of thinking that it avoids the extreme implausibility of Platonizing with respect to art. I hope I have succeeded in dispelling some of that apparent implausibility here. I am under no illusion that I have dispelled it all. Hello.